This is Inside the Americas, coming up. Governor Gavin Newsom easily survives a recall vote in California. Republicans had forced through that election to try and push the Democrat out of office. Haiti's new Prime Minister Ariel Henry fires the country's top prosecutor. That's after that prosecutor said Henry should be criminally charged in the recent assassination of the president. And The Great White Way opens up once again. Hit Broadway shows like The Lion King, Hamilton, and Wicked open back up at full capacity this week for the first time in 18 months. I'm Jeannie Godula. This week, the governor of California easily beat back a Republican campaign to push him out of office. Gavin Newsom survived the recall election, leaving dozens of challengers far, far behind. The win sends a strong message that California voters are still behind Newsom and the traditional policies of the deeply democratic state. Here's a closer look at the uniquely American recall vote.
And thank you for rejecting this recall. Good night.
Gavin Newsom gets to keep his job after surviving the attempt to unseat him as governor of California in a recall election. The recall mechanism allows US citizens in 19 states to trigger a vote by launching a petition.
A recall election is almost like what other countries would call a vote of confidence, where the legislature or the parliament decides whether to keep the prime minister in office. But in this case, it's done by the voters themselves.
Indeed, it's how Hollywood actor and Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor back in 2003 when he unseated Democrat Gray Davis. While recall efforts are common, this year's was only the second in Californian history to gather enough signatures to be put to a vote, equivalent to 12% of the number of people who voted in the last election. The campaign began pre-COVID, run by a group of Republican voters, but soon became about Newsom's handling of the pandemic.
The recall backers really got two tremendous breaks. One was when Governor Newsom very visibly went to have a dinner at a very fancy place called the French Laundry, where people were sitting close by without masks. And also a state court judge gave them 4 more months to gather signatures at the very moment that they were really drawing some support.
It started to look a bit shaky for Newsom in the final weeks, as his Republican rival Larry Elder's campaign gathered steam. But it wasn't to be for the conservative talk radio host.
My opponent, Governor Gavin Newsom. Come on. Let's be gracious. Let's be gracious in defeat.
The recall election cost $280 million. 69% of likely voters say the process was a waste of their money.
This week, Haiti's new Prime Minister Ariel Henry fired his top prosecutor. That's after the prosecutor recommended Henry be criminally charged in the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. The Prime Minister was sworn in just after Moïse was killed 2 months ago. Henry now accused of having 2 phone calls with the key suspect in the murder the night of the killing. Brian Quinn has more.
Ariel Henry, Haiti's new prime minister, a former minister of labor, a former neuropathologist, now a suspect in the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. On Tuesday, Haiti's top prosecutor recommended charges against Henry over Moïse's killing. Henry responded by swiftly and publicly firing that chief prosecutor, whose replacement was sworn in within hours. The prime minister has insisted he's innocent in the Moïse affair.
The actions to create confusion and prevent justice will not be allowed to happen. The real culprits, the masterminds, those responsible for the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse will be brought to justice and punished for their acts.
Moïse was shot to death in the early hours of July 7th when a group of commandos posing as U.S. drug enforcement agents stormed his residential compound. Dozens have been arrested in the wake of the raid, including 18 former Colombian soldiers and 2 Haitian Americans. But several key suspects remain at large, including a fugitive former employee of the Justice Ministry's anti-corruption unit, whom Henry has publicly defended. Prosecutors say the prime minister spoke with that suspect twice by telephone on the night of Moïse's assassination. Henri dismissed their requests to question him as political theater, and only the country's president has the authority to compel a sitting prime minister to undergo interrogation. The Constitution also stipulates, however, that prosecutors can only be fired or appointed by the president, a position that remains vacant since Moïse's death.
Our number of the week is this one, 3.6 million pesos, or around $183,000. That's the cost of a house once used by the world's most notorious drug kingpin, El Chapo. He stunned the world 7 years ago with a dramatic escape from the safe house surrounded by Mexican Marines via a hole under the bathtub. El Chapo spent years on the run until his capture in 2015. The house is now up for grabs in Mexico's national lottery. We'll go now to Brazil for a look at the Quilombos, communities founded by enslaved Africans who fled to Brazil during colonial times. Their descendants continue to preserve the culture of their ancestors even today. Over the past decade, though, the Kalunga Quilombo, the largest such community in Brazil, has been abandoned by the government. But thanks to tourism, things are changing for the better. Mariam Kone, Laura Damas, and Lucinda Elliott report.
In the heart of the Brazilian savannah, between mountains that once served to protect from slave owners, Engenho 2 is the most accessible of the Kalunga Quilombo communities. Adriano, who grew up on its dusty, arid land, wants to share the hidden treasures of his people.
Hello, welcome. I'm your guide. I'm here to show you the beauty and history of the Kalunga Quilombo, which has existed for over 370 years.
Victims of racism and discrimination, in 2008, the members of this Quilombo started to improvise as local tour guides. In the decades since, they've received 100,000 tourists, creating new jobs, like Adriano's, who used to work on neighbouring farms for much less pay.
I used to work in other people's fields to get some money to help my family. Sometimes they didn't pay me. Now I work in my family's fields, a job near nature, near the waterfalls.
Santa Barbara is one of the most famous waterfalls in the region. After being forced to close due to the pandemic, it's recently reopened to tourists. The site used to attract around 7,000 people annually, but today only a few dozen privileged visitors get to enjoy its crystal clear waters.
An invigorating bath. The water is freezing, but the place is wonderful.
At first we came just to discover this waterfall, but thanks to our guide and our contact with the community, we learned a lot, especially about the history of Brazil and the Kalunga.
Here, each tourist pays the equivalent of €40 that goes directly to the community. This money, however small, allows the Kalunga to make improvements. Natalia, who began the project, has managed to build new classrooms, a health clinic, as well as other infrastructure on her land. Things that ought to be supplied and funded by the government.
This is a water tank. It's thanks to the money paid by tourists who come here to enjoy the waterfalls that we're able to afford it. This water is extremely important to us because it allows us to live closer as a community. This reservoir supplies water to about 700 people.
On top of less funding from tourism, the precious Kalunga territory is being taken over by soybean farmers. Last year, more than 1,000 hectares of community land was illegally invaded and destroyed to make way for crops.
We'll wrap up now on the Great White Way, where Broadway is finally back in action. Theaters in Manhattan opened at full capacity this week for the first time in 18 months. Big hits like The Lion King, Hamilton, and Wicked are back up and running, much to the delight of the fans. Yuka Raye took a look.
The day has finally come. In front of a raucous audience, Broadway juggernaut Wicked sprang back to life.
It's going to see me!
Other top musicals, The Lion King, Hamilton and Chicago, also had the curtain go up after a staggering 18-month closure. Hamilton's creator was holding back his tears as he thanked health workers and supporters.
I don't ever want to take live theater for granted ever again, do you?
Some shows, like Bruce Springsteen and Hadestown, have been performing at limited capacity since the summer. But Tuesday was the first day Broadway theatres could pack their halls full, marking the final step in New York's reopening.
After long 18-plus months, it's just nice to have live theater back and to bring joy to the community and everyone.
When they went on sale and I saw them say that Broadway was coming back, and I just logged right on and I got like really good seats at really good price like right away, so snapped them up.
The full reopening comes after months spent on upgrading air filter systems and figuring out how to keep the virus at bay, both for actors, audiences and backstage staff.
That's all the time we have for this Inside the Americas. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week for all the news from north to south.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Reggane, a town in the Algerian Sahara, whose name will forever be associated with French nuclear testing. For almost a decade, France used it as an open-air laboratory, exposing Algerian civilians and French soldiers to radiation.
On est des cobayes du nucléaire.
60 years later, French victims are starting to receive compensation, while Algerian victims are still waiting. Revisited returns to the ruins of Reggane. Watch it on France 24 and France24.com.